We also have Katie Dix, who's the Sea Green Coordinator at Parks and People Foundation. And so she's been working on looking at risk perception in urban soils. So not just metal contaminants, but what are some of the other things that make urban soils riskier, and how do people perceive working in urban soils?
How's everybody doing tonight? Good. A lot of information, and I do have some overlapping information that Anne presented. Some I will feel is very important to reiterate. Some I'll just move over because I know Cheryl has a wonderful presentation and can probably use some extra time. So I wanted to start off with just a little example, a little story. Once upon a time in 2010, there was a vacant lot that wasn't really all that vacant because there were some wonderful things like tires and overgrown vines and trash and abandoned buildings and lots of other things. But there was a group of people that thought that this space could be a garden. And they turned it into what is now the Baltimore Free Farm, which is actually a little bit more of a community garden, not necessarily a farm, but you can see a big, big change. So when we talk about soil contamination, lead and other heavy metals and lead uptake in crops are usually what we talk about. They kind of dictate the conversation. But today we're going to be talking a little bit more about different things like routes of exposure, like soil ingestion, inhalation, and dermal exposure, and some other hazards that you might encounter, like needles and trash, while you are developing a space for gardening or farming. So you can go to the next slide. Right now, I am working Sea Green with the Center for a Livable Future from Johns Hopkins University on a study that has a very long title, Understanding Urban Gardeners' Perceptions of Risk from Soil Contamination, Communication of Risk Knowledge and Resources Between Individuals, Communities, and Institutions. Yes, that's a mouthful.
What's the acronym?
There is no acronym. There is no acronym. There is no shortcut. I just kind of avoid it and say exactly what it is. It's a risk perception analysis. And what we're trying to do is just understand what people's perceived risk is regarding soil contaminants and some of these other hazards that they might encounter. Our focus is community gardens, and that's because that's just sort of how it was developed. But a lot of this information is very, very relevant to people that are also doing urban farming. And since we started the study, we did decide to add a few urban farms to our research, and I'll talk a little bit more about the methods in a little bit. But another fundamental aim of this research is to assess and unveil just how information and resources are being communicated to people that want to do this kind of work. Information and services delivered from both governmental agencies, but also nonprofits, academic institutions, community associations, and these other beacons of information for people. Oh, well, that's a nice, I guess it's all going to pop up. And this is just logo fun. So we can skip over this one. These are the people that are working, with us. Again, the Center for a Livable Future, and we do have a grant from Urban Health. So how we're doing this research, it's sort of twofold. So we have the key informant interviews, and we're doing 15, and Carol was actually one of ours. Our next presenter, Cheryl, was another, where we're doing these in-depth interviews. They're more open-ended, semi-structured. They're taking about 30 minutes to an hour, sometimes almost 2, depending on who we're talking to. And these are people that are just sort of seen as the experts. These are the people or representatives of organizations that people are going to for information. The second part are really these community garden surveys. And we are hoping to get around 200 surveys, all with community gardeners and now some urban farmers. There are 25 questions, including some demographic information, and we are surveying around 30 different gardens. So this is a map that was developed by Center for a Livable Future, the Bloomberg School of Public Health, and this is using information from Sea Green Gardens. So this map indicates where gardens are located, self-identified, food-producing community gardens. Again, all that are registered with the Community Greening Resource Network. The vast majority of these gardens are located in areas of the city where the median income is below the rate that the USDA uses for poverty, used to determine who qualifies for free and reduced school lunches, and SNAP and WIC programs, things like that. Some of these community gardens are actually transitioning or want to transition into what they're calling community farms. And at the current time, and Maya and I have talked about this, there's really not a clear definition of which is which. But for the purposes of today, and I might refer to this again later in the presentation, a community farm is an organization or individual that is growing with the intent to sell or provide food for people that are not necessarily working on that site. So again, we focused on these gardens, but all this information really is so overlapping. So this is a Wordle, and I don't know how many people are familiar with Wordles. They look really cool. I'm sure a lot of people have seen them before. And we used a program, Wordle.net, where we plugged in all the information that we were gathering from these surveys and these interviews, and how large a word is relative to how many times it was mentioned in comparison to the others. So like I said, lead, it really kind of dictates our conversation when we think about soil contaminants. And this was in response to the question, what soil contaminants are you aware of? You can go to the next slide. So how can gardeners come in contact with soil contaminants? Again, there really were not a whole lot of answers, but we are hitting some of the big ones. Eating crops that might have uptake some of that, the dermal contact with the soil itself, and the dust inhalation. So can we go back to the previous slide? So what soil contaminants? Again, lead really is dictating the conversation, but you know, there's a lot of other things in here. I love, you know, the feces and the glass and trash and asbestos, but one of the ones that's pretty large in comparison is this, I don't know. So when we're asking people what contaminants, a lot of people are answering, I don't know. And you can go ahead too. So when we rephrase the question a little bit differently, as a community gardener, do you have any concerns about hazards to your health? And I'm sorry that got cut off. You can see that there's much more of a variety in response and how many times things are answered. So soil contamination and soil contaminants are pretty large on here. And people do know that we are focusing this study on those things. But you're seeing a lot of other things like water quality and people wanting to know about rain barrels and you know what is in that rainwater, the glass, the needles, the pressure treated wood, fecal matter from animals or humans, other types of pollution. A lot of these gardens or farms are located relatively close to a parking lot or a street, and a lot of people have talked about that air pollution and runoffs from those areas and what that would look like. So when Tyler emailed the participants of this panel, he said that this was probably one of the most important conversations that we needed to have, but it's also one of the most controversial. And why that is because we just have a lot of questions that we don't have concrete answers to right now. To add to the confusion, there are a lot of urban myths and what we think are recommendations regarding sunflowers and pressure treated wood and lead uptake in the crops, and it gets a little confusing. So, you know, why the confusion? Well, what's right and what's safe? Safety is a word that we've been playing around a lot with during this study, and the reason is because safe is such a subjective term. It's a relative term, and it really means something different to everyone. It's a matter of what you feel comfortable with and how you perceive the situation to be, which is exactly why we're doing this. Even the professionals that we're talking to that are delivering some of this information are having a hard time and expressing that they're having a hard time accessing risk and communicating that to individuals that want to do this kind of work, and answering questions about what exactly is safe. There's a lot of informal networks for knowledge sharing, not just among the gardeners, but among the professionals themselves. During our key informant interviews, we are constantly having people say, oh, well, I send people here, I would just call so-and-so, XYZ, and these very informal networks of knowledge sharing. So it's not always clear who you should be talking to, or who has the right information, who's the right office to contact. In addition, as a city, we don't really have a set standard or best practice for methods that we should be using. And it's become pretty clear, I think, to everyone before this study even started that we needed to do some capacity building on a local level. And there are people that are doing that right now. The Farmers Alliance of Baltimore is working on developing standards for all of their farmers. The Office of Sustainability and Food Pack is organizing people to have these conversations. And as a result of this study, we are hoping to develop some information and some best practices suggestions. So it's not that we're behind the curve, and when I was talking with the rest of my research team, we're putting together this presentation, and it's like, well, it sounds so scary to say that we don't necessarily know what's right and that we don't have a set practice. But we're not behind the curve. In a lot of ways, Baltimore is ahead of the curve, and I can't tell you how many other cities I visited where people are, oh, you're from Baltimore? That's incredible. You have so much growing. And people use that a lot. You have so much growing. It's incredible. And they're very envious that we are sort of the pioneer in a lot of ways for some of this urban agriculture. But what it does mean as a pioneer is that we do have a sense of obligation to not only assess and investigate the issues that are directly in front of us, but again, to develop these standards, these best practices, so that we can pass that on to other people and really preserve ourselves in a lot of ways and preserve our health. So you can go to the next slide. I'm gonna show. Okay, so I did want to make some recommendations and definitely touched on site history a whole lot. I have 3 S's. We figured out today that there are 3 S's. So it's site history, soil testing, and safety. So site history, Anne talked about the Sanborn maps, and I just want to go over this again because it is so important to know the history of your site. It provides you with context that allows you to develop it further appropriately. It gives you clues on what you should be investigating, what you should be looking for, people that you might need to talk to. And the Sanborn maps are available at the Enoch Pratt Library. You can actually go to the central branch of the library and someone will assist you with those maps. They are online and there are lots of other ways to find them, but there are people that will help you. And that is such a big thing that people don't necessarily know. One of the questions on our survey for the community gardeners is, do you know the previous use of your site? And a lot of them do not know. What's even more concerning is that they don't know where to find that information. So go to the library and get some help. Just another word on the Sanborn maps is that they do have information about not only the building's previous function, but all the materials that were used that they have record of, so you can get that information and someone will help you. So go to the library. The next slide is just, just some pictures, but have your soil tested. It's not going to tell you everything that you need to know, and again, that's why your site history is so important to investigate. But at this time, it's the best way to really know what kinds of those heavy metals and some other contaminants you're working with. Consider having your soil from your site tested along with some of the materials that you might be bringing in. Anne mentioned about 20% glass that might be in the area that you're working with. So it's very probable that, and and Cheryl will talk about soil remediation a little bit and building your soil, but it's probable that you will be bringing in outside materials, things like fill dirt or compost and other soil amendments. So really consider having those tested as well, and at the very least becoming familiar with all those materials and the sources in which they're coming from. I can't tell you how many people have been raving to me about this mushroom compost from Pennsylvania. And when I ask them what it is, they say, well, it's from Pennsylvania and it's mushroom compost, and they don't really have a lot of information. And I'm not here to put down the mushroom compost, especially because Master Gardener Larry Close is one of the biggest advocates, and I am never going to be quick to question anything that he's saying. And it's very true that this might, very well be the product that is providing your plants with the nutrients it needs. But what people don't know is that it is pretty much chicken or other manure. And while, some people are very comfortable using manure, there are plenty of food scientists and soil scientists that do have some reservation about chicken feed and therefore the manure that's caused as a result. So please know your materials, know what you're getting, know what you're putting into that space, and have your soil tested. The other recommendation is the safety. This is the third S, and that's making adaptations to some of your hygiene practices. Some of these sound so simple, but they're practices that are often lost. Things like washing all of your produce very thoroughly, or peeling, using gloves, reserving a pair of boots that stay on the farm or don't enter your house so that you're not tracking that soil indoors, or some of those other contaminants. It's just so important because you never know what you're dealing with, and it's not just that soil, but things like fecal matter or contaminants that's on your trash or other pollutants. You just don't know. And again, it just sounds so simple, especially if you're working with children. And if you go to the next slide. And this kid, and there should be a circle around this kid, I like to say this kid would look so much cuter with gloves on. Because especially when we talk about lead, that is a contaminant that is going to directly affect children much more than you as an adult. But as a farmer, your risk is somewhat higher than the people that you're serving, your consumer. So just really think about your practices and amending those, and being conscious of the fact that you're dealing with a lot of different things. Like Anne said, you're dealing with anyone's guess a lot of times, especially if you're working with a new space. So like I said, we really don't feel like we're behind the curve by any means, but historically we are an industrial city. So we do have some things to worry about and issues to address. And they're not always things that happened in the past, but things that might be happening now. So you can see that this is another community garden. This is where people are gardening and growing food. And in the background, there's this beautiful demolition that's happening. So you need to be able to adapt what you're doing, and communicate with your neighbors, and being considerate of what might be changing or happening around your site. Not just what happened before, but what could possibly happen in the future. So we talked about the city being interested in creating these resource guides with specific recommendations and guidelines to Baltimore. We're still really trying to figure out who all of these experts are. And part of that is really to make sure that their information is accessible and applied to what we're doing. So here is my shameless plug, and I'm happy that Anne kind of already made this plug, but oh, we're down a little bit, but Rufus Cheney from the USDA will be here next Tuesday in Baltimore. He will be at the Silver and Arboretum, and this is a free lecture. It's open to the public. And like Ann said, he is sort of the, what did you say, the godfather of
40 years of research.
40 years of research, and he has been doing research on Baltimore specifically since 1980. When I first asked him to come out and speak, he sent me, oh my gosh, I don't know how many PowerPoint slides and papers, including one about beets and carrots and how their uptake is different because of the way that they are formatted and their xylem and phloem, and I am still trying to get through that piece right now, but he has so much information and we're so excited to have him here. So please come and check that out. I was debating whether or not I wish that he was here before my presentation so I could steal some of his information, but I think it's better now that you can all experience that presentation as well. So my contact information is at the bottom. I'm sorry, the blue is a little hard to read. But this, please, if you are able to come out and hear this man talk, because I am not the expert, and I know that it's really intimidating to be up here with Cheryl and Ann, and sometimes I am asked to do these presentations, and I ask, why? And while we were putting together, this as a research team, it was very clear why, because we are still trying to figure this out. And there are people that are willing to work together and figure this out and get those experts to contribute their knowledge, and we can figure out how to apply it to what's relevant right now. So I will leave all the questions until our panel, and I hope Cheryl has enough time to talk now. Thank you.